The storm came down from the mountains like the wrath of God himself, catching Frank Northwood 3 miles from anywhere civilized in the Colorado Territory winter of 1878. One moment he could see the trail ahead. The next he was squinting through a wall of white so thick his horse nearly stumbled off the narrow path. The wind howled like wounded animals, cutting through his coat as if it were made of paper rather than good thick wool. Frank pulled his hat down tighter and urged his gelding forward, knowing that stopping in this weather meant freezing to death before morning. He had been riding since dawn, trying to make it to Vulture City before the weather turned, but winter in the Rockies did not care about the plans of men. The snow came faster now, already several inches deep and building higher with each passing minute. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves, and he could barely feel the reins anymore. The horse beneath him trembled with cold and exhaustion. Through the white curtain ahead, Frank thought he saw something dark against the snow. A building, maybe, or at least some kind of shelter. He guided his horse toward it, praying it was not just a trick of the storm. As he drew closer, the shape solidified into a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. Thank God someone was home. Frank dismounted with difficulty, his legs stiff from hours in the saddle and the bitter cold. He led his horse toward what looked like a small barn beside the cabin and got the animal inside, out of the worst of the wind. Then he stumbled through the deepening snow to the cabin door and knocked, though his frozen knuckles barely made a sound against the wood. The door opened a crack and a woman peered out. Even through his snow-crusted eyelashes, Frank could see she was beautiful, with dark hair pulled back and eyes the color of summer sky. She looked at him with surprise and something else, something wary. "Please," Frank managed through chattering teeth. "Caught in the storm, need shelter." The woman hesitated only a moment before pulling the door open wider. "Get inside before you freeze to death." Frank stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, snow falling from his coat onto her clean wooden floor. The heat from the fireplace felt like heaven after the bitter cold outside. He stood there dripping and shivering while the woman shut the door firmly against the howling wind. "Get those wet things off," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to taking charge. "You will catch your death standing there in soaked clothes." Frank's fingers fumbled with the buttons of his coat, too numb to work properly. The woman stepped forward and helped him, her touch efficient and impersonal. She hung his coat on a peg near the door and pointed to a chair by the fire. "Sit down. I will get you something hot to drink." Frank sank into the chair gratefully, holding his hands toward the flames. Feeling started to return to his fingers, a painful prickling that made him wince. He looked around the cabin properly for the first time. It was small but well kept, with handmade furniture and curtains on the windows. A bed stood in one corner, a table with 2 chairs in another. Everything spoke of a woman living alone, making do with what she had. She returned with a cup of coffee, strong and hot. Frank wrapped his hands around it and drank, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you," he said when he could speak without his teeth chattering. "I am Frank Northwood. I was heading to Vulture City when the storm caught me." The woman nodded, standing a careful distance away. "Julia Sawyer, this is my land." "I am grateful for your hospitality, Mrs. Sawyer. I would have frozen out there." "Widow Sawyer," she corrected quietly. "My husband died 2 years ago. I am sorry for your loss." Julia moved to the window and looked out at the storm. Snow was piling against the glass and the wind rattled the shutters. "You cannot go anywhere tonight. The storm looks bad. You will have to stay until it passes." Frank nodded, though the situation was far from ideal. A single man and a widow alone in a cabin would set tongues wagging in any town, but there was no help for it. The alternative was dying in the snow. I will not impose more than necessary, he said. Soon as the storm breaks, I will be on my way. Julia turned from the window. Are you hungry? I have stew left from supper. I do not want to take your food. I have enough. And you look half-starved under all that cold. She ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to him with a spoon. Frank ate gratefully, the hot food bringing more warmth back into his body. Julia moved around the cabin, doing small tasks, always keeping that careful distance. Frank studied her when she was not looking. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 25 or 26. Beautiful in a quiet way with strong features and capable hands. There was a sadness in her eyes that spoke of more than just widowhood. How long have you lived out here alone? Frank asked. Since my husband died. Before that, we worked this land together for 3 years. She paused in her work. People in town say I should sell and move somewhere more civilized, but this is my home, I will not give it up. That takes courage, or stubbornness. A small smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. My mother always said I had too much of that. The wind howled louder, and more snow piled against the windows. Julia went to check that the shutters were secure while Frank finished his stew. The cabin was warm and dry, a small sanctuary against the fury outside. But Frank could feel the tension in the air, the awkwardness of two strangers forced into unwanted intimacy by circumstance. You can have the bed, Julia said. I will sit by the fire. No, madam, I cannot take your bed, I will be fine in the chair. You are half frozen and exhausted. You need proper rest. And you need your bed. I have slept in worse places than a chair by a warm fire. They stood at an impasse until Julia sighed. We are both being foolish. The bed is big enough for 2 if we stay on our own sides. I have extra blankets we can put down the middle. It would not be proper, but freezing or collapsing from exhaustion would not be proper either. Frank felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. Are you sure? I am a practical woman, Mr. Northwood. This storm could last for days. We both need rest. She met his eyes directly. I am trusting that you are a gentleman. You have my word. Julia nodded and began arranging blankets on the bed, creating a firm barrier down the middle. Frank looked away, feeling awkward and strangely warm at the same time. He had been alone on the trail for weeks, and before that, he had been alone in other ways for longer than he cared to remember. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, they settled into an uneasy routine. Julia banked the fire while Frank checked that the door was secure. They spoke little, both conscious of the strange situation. Finally, there was nothing left to do but sleep. Frank lay down on his side of the bed, staying as close to the edge as possible. Julia did the same on her side, the barrier of blankets between them. In the darkness, Frank could hear her breathing, could sense the warmth of another human being nearby. It had been a long time since he had shared a bed with anyone, even in this chaste way. Mr. Northwood, Julia's voice came softly through the dark. Yes, thank you for being respectful. I would never do anything to make you uncomfortable, madam. A long silence. Then, you can call me Julia, Frank. Another silence, this one somehow warmer. Outside, the storm howled and the snow piled higher, but inside the small cabin, 2 lonely people found an unexpected moment of connection. Frank woke several times during the night. Each time, he could hear the wind still raging outside. Once, he heard Julia crying softly in her sleep. He lay there in the darkness, wanting to offer comfort, but knowing it would not be appropriate. When morning finally came, gray light filtered through the snow-covered windows. Frank rose quietly and rebuilt the fire, trying not to wake Julia. But she stirred anyway, sitting up with her hair falling loose around her shoulders. For a moment they looked at each other in the pale morning light, and Frank felt something shift in his chest. "The storm has not stopped," Julia said, going to the window. Snow was still falling, though not as heavily as before. But during the night it had piled up to halfway up the door. "We are snowed in," Frank observed. "It happens every winter, sometimes for days." Julia turned from the window, and in the morning light, Frank could see the exhaustion in her face, the lines of strain around her eyes. "I will make breakfast." They moved around each other carefully in the small space, always aware of each other's presence. Julia made pancakes and coffee, while Frank brought in more wood from the covered pile outside the back door. The domesticity of it felt strange and right at the same time. Over breakfast, they began to talk more easily. Frank told her about his work as a ranch hand, moving from place to place, never settling anywhere for long. Julia talked about her life on the small homestead, the chickens she kept, the vegetable garden she tended in summer. "My husband was not a rancher," she said quietly. "He was a miner. Went to work in the silver mines near Leadville. There was an accident." She looked down at her plate. "They brought his body back to me wrapped in canvas. I am sorry. It was 2 years ago, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." She paused. "And sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." "Does that make sense?" "It does." Julia looked at him with those blue eyes. "You have lost someone too, I can see it in your face." Frank nodded slowly. "My wife died in childbirth 5 years ago, the baby too, a son." He had not spoken of this to anyone in a long time. "I sold our farm after that. Could not stay there with all the memories. Been drifting ever since." "I am sorry for your loss." They sat in silence for a while, two people who understood grief in a way that only those who had experienced it could. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, something was beginning to thaw. The day passed slowly. There was not much to do except talk and tend the fire. Julia worked on some mending while Frank repaired a broken chair leg he had noticed. They spoke of small things and large ones, their conversation flowing more easily as the hours went by. "Why Vulture City?" Julia asked as the afternoon light began to fade. "Looking for work. Heard they needed ranch hands at the big spreads around there." "And then what?" "Work for a season and move on again." Frank paused in his work on the chair. "I suppose so. It is what I have been doing." "Does it not get lonely? Never staying anywhere long enough to make a home, sometimes." He looked at her. "But staying in one place can be lonely too." Julia's hands stilled on her mending. "Yes, it can be." That night they settled into bed with less awkwardness than before. The barrier of blankets was still there, but it seemed less necessary somehow. They talked in the darkness, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, the lives they had thought they would have. "I wanted children," Julia confessed. "A whole house full of them, but it never happened, and now it never will. You are still young." "I am 26. And there are not many men interested in a widow living alone on a hardscrabble homestead miles from town." "Then they are fools." In the darkness, Frank felt Julia turn toward him. "Why do you say that?" "Because you are brave and strong and beautiful. Any man would be lucky to have you." A long silence. Then Julia's voice, soft and wondering. "No one has called me beautiful in a very long time." Frank's heart hammered in his chest. The blanket barrier seemed suddenly very thin. "Well, you are." The next morning the storm had passed. They woke to brilliant sunshine on deep snow. The world transformed into a landscape of white. Frank knew he should dig out and leave, but he found himself reluctant to go. He told himself it was because the snow was still too deep for safe travel, but he knew it was more than that. Julia made no mention of him leaving either. Instead, they worked together to dig a path to the barn so Frank could check on his horse. The animal had weathered the storm well enough, though it was clear he needed rest before traveling. Your horse should recover for a few days before you try to ride him anywhere, Julia said, stroking the gelding's nose. The trail to Vulture City will be dangerous with all this snow. I do not want to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary. Julia looked at him directly. You are not imposing. I like having someone to talk to. It gets very quiet here alone. So Frank stayed another day, and then another. He made himself useful, fixing things around the cabin that had needed repair, chopping extra wood, tending to Julia's small barn and the chickens that had huddled together during the storm. Julia cooked and mended his trail-worn clothes and filled the cabin with the warmth of her presence. They fell into an easy partnership, moving around each other with increasing familiarity. Frank found himself watching Julia as she worked, admiring the grace of her movements, the way the firelight caught in her hair. Sometimes he caught her watching him too, a soft expression in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. On the fourth night, as they lay in the darkness with the blanket barrier between them, Julia spoke quietly. "Frank, yes, I am glad the storm brought you here." Frank felt warmth spread through his chest. So am I. Even if it means being trapped with a widow in the middle of nowhere, especially because of that. He paused. Julia, I have been alone for a long time, thought I wanted to be. But being here with you, I am starting to remember what it feels like to have a home. He heard her breath catch. I know what you mean, I have been alone too, told myself I was fine with it, but I was just afraid. Afraid of what? Of caring about someone again. Of losing them like I lost my husband. Her voice trembled slightly. Of being hurt again. Frank's hand found hers across the blanket barrier, their fingers intertwined in the darkness. I understand. I have been afraid too. They lay like that for a long time, hands joined, neither speaking. The simple touch felt more intimate than anything Frank had experienced in years. When they finally fell asleep, their hands were still clasped together. The next morning brought a change between them, subtle but undeniable. The blanket barrier remained, but their hands found each other across it. They stood closer when working together. Their eyes met and held for longer moments. "Frank," Julia said as they worked together to prepare the noon meal, "how long were you planning to stay in Vulture City? As long as the work lasted, I suppose. Why?" She turned to face him, her expression serious. What if there was work here? Not much pay, but room and board. This homestead needs a lot of repairs, and I cannot do them all myself. Frank's heart began to pound. Are you offering me a job? I am offering you a place to stay if you want it. For as long as you want it, Julia, people will talk. A single man living with a widow. Let them talk. I am tired of living my life worried about what other people think. She met his eyes. I like having you here. The cabin feels less empty. I feel less empty. Frank crossed the small space between them and took her hands in his. I like being here with you, but I do not want to damage your reputation. My reputation will survive, and maybe in time there could be a way to make it proper. Her cheeks flushed pink. If you wanted. If we found that we suited each other. Frank understood what she was saying, what she was offering, not just a job, but a possibility, a future. Hope flickered in his chest like a candle flame. I would like to stay, he said quietly. I would like that very much. Julia smiled, truly smiled, and it transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. Then stay. The days that followed were some of the happiest Frank could remember. He threw himself into the work of the homestead, repairing the barn roof, fixing the chicken coop, chopping enough wood to last through the rest of winter. Julia worked beside him when she could, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm together. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, sharing more of their lives, their thoughts, their dreams. Frank told her about growing up in Missouri, learning to ride and rope from his father. Julia spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, how her family had come west looking for opportunity. "We had nothing back east," she said. "My father thought he could make a fortune in the silver mines. Instead, he died of lung fever the first winter. My mother and I barely survived. When I was 18, I married Thomas Sawyer. He was a good man, but he had the same dream as my father. The mines took him too, and you stayed. Where else would I go? This land is all I have. Thomas and I filed the claim together, built this cabin with our own hands. I will not let it go without a fight." Frank admired her determination, her strength. But he could also see the loneliness that haunted her eyes, the weight of struggling alone for so long. One evening, as they sat close together by the fire, Frank reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind Julia's ear. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "Julia," he said softly, "I know we have not known each other long, but I feel like I have been waiting to find you my whole life." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I feel the same way. It frightens me how quickly this has happened." "Does it have to be frightening?" "After losing Thomas, I swore I would never let myself care for anyone again. It hurt too much." Frank took her hands in his. "I made the same promise after my Mary died, but I am learning that being alone is its own kind of hurt. Maybe we deserve a second chance at happiness." Tears glistened in Julia's eyes. "Do you really think we could have that?" "I think we could try." Julia leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "I would like to try." That night, Frank removed the blanket barrier himself before they went to bed. Julia watched him do it, saying nothing. When they lay down, she moved close to him and he wrapped his arms around her. They held each other in the darkness, two wounded souls finding comfort in each other's warmth. "I am afraid," Julia whispered against his chest. "So am I. But you will stay." "I will stay as long as you want me. Then stay forever." Frank kissed the top of her head. "Forever sounds good to me." The weeks passed, winter slowly loosening its grip on the mountains. Frank and Julia grew closer with each passing day. They worked together, ate together, slept wrapped in each other's arms. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They learned each other's habits, their likes and dislikes, the small details that make up a life. Frank discovered that Julia sang softly while she worked, old hymns and folk songs her mother had taught her. She learned that Frank could not sleep without checking the door one last time, a habit from years of sleeping in bunkhouses and camps. He found out she was afraid of thunderstorms. She discovered he had a sweet tooth he tried to hide. They also began to talk about the future, carefully at first, then with more certainty. "We should be married properly," Frank said one evening, "as soon as the weather allows us to get to town." Julia looked up from her sewing. "You are sure?" "You have only known me a few weeks. I have never been more sure of anything." He knelt beside her chair. "Julia Sawyer, will you marry me? I do not have a ring to offer you and I am not a rich man, but I can promise to work hard to take care of you, to love you for as long as I live." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Frank pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly for the first time. It was sweet and tender and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "When?" Julia asked. "As soon as we can get to town and find a preacher. There is a minister in Vulture City, if the roads are clear enough to travel. Then we will go as soon as we can." That night, as they lay together, Julia traced patterns on Frank's chest with her fingers. "I never thought I would feel this way again. Happy, hopeful, neither did I." Frank caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever." "What is that?" "A reason to build instead of drift, a place to belong." Julia kissed him softly. "You belong here. With me." 2 weeks later, when the roads had cleared enough for travel, they rode together to Vulture City. The town was small but bustling, full of miners and ranchers and all the commerce that followed them. People stared at Frank and Julia as they rode down the main street together, and Frank could see the speculation in their eyes. They found the minister at a small white church at the edge of town. Reverend Patterson was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He listened as Frank explained their situation. "So you want to be married right away?" the Reverend asked. "Yes, sir," Frank said firmly. "We have been living under the same roof for several weeks now, and we want to make it proper and legal." Reverend Patterson looked at Julia. "Is this what you want, Mrs. Sawyer?" "It is," Julia said clearly. "I love Frank and he loves me. We want to be married." The Reverend smiled. "Then who am I to stand in the way of love? Do you have witnesses?" Frank had not thought of that. But before he could speak, a woman's voice came from the doorway. "I will witness for them." They turned to see a woman about Julia's age standing there, dressed in a simple calico dress. She had red hair and green eyes and a friendly smile. "Margaret," Julia said in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I saw you ride into town. Figured you might need a friend." Margaret came forward and took Julia's hands. "It is good to see you, Julia, and you are getting married. I am so happy for you." Julia introduced Margaret O'Brien, a woman she had known since coming to Colorado. Margaret quickly found her husband, Sean, to serve as the second witness, and within an hour, Frank and Julia stood before Reverend Patterson, speaking their vows. "I, Frank Northwood, take you, Julia Sawyer, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Julia's voice was steady and clear as she repeated the vows. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed his bride tenderly, aware of their small audience but caring only about the woman in his arms. After the ceremony, Margaret insisted they come to the O'Brien home for a wedding supper. It was a modest celebration, but warm and genuine. Margaret and Sean were good people, and Frank could see the relief in Julia's face at having friends who supported their marriage. "I was worried people would judge us," Julia confessed quietly to Margaret while the men talked. "Some will," Margaret said honestly. "But those who matter will see that you have found happiness. You deserve that, Julia, after everything you have been through." That night, Frank and Julia stayed at the small hotel in Vulture City, their first night as husband and wife. Frank carried her over the threshold of their room, making her laugh. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "Mrs. Northwood," he said softly. "Mr. Northwood," she replied, smiling. They came together slowly, tenderly, two people who had known loss learning to trust in love again. Frank was gentle with Julia, aware that she had been alone for a long time, that this meant as much to her as it did to him. She responded to his touch with a passion that matched his own, and when they finally lay together in the aftermath, both felt complete in a way they had not in years. "I love you," Julia whispered against his chest. "I love you too," Frank replied, holding her close. "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you know it." They returned to the homestead the next day as husband and wife. The cabin looked the same, but everything felt different now. This was their home, the place where they would build their life together. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought new life and new possibilities. Frank and Julia worked together to plant an expanded vegetable garden. Frank built a new chicken coop and repaired the corral fence. Julia sewed curtains for the windows and made the cabin more of a home. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red, Julia took Frank's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Frank looked at her, hope and fear warring in his chest. "What is it?" "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Frank could not speak. After losing Mary and their son, he had never thought he would have another chance at fatherhood. Tears filled his eyes as he pulled Julia into his arms. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure. I have known for a few weeks but wanted to be certain before I told you." "How do you feel? Scared? Happy? Hopeful?" She pulled back to look at him. "Are you glad?" "Glad." "Julia, you have just given me the greatest gift in the world." He kissed her tenderly. "I am more than glad, I am blessed." Julia's pregnancy was not easy. She was sick in the mornings and tired easily. But Frank was there for her every step of the way, taking over the heavier chores, making sure she rested, holding her when the fear became too much. "What if something goes wrong?" Julia asked one night, her voice small in the darkness. Frank knew she was thinking of his Mary, of the childbirth that had taken both mother and baby. He held her close and spoke firmly. "Nothing will go wrong. We will get you to town well before your time. The doctor there is good, Margaret told me so. You are strong and healthy, Julia. You and our baby will be fine. Promise me." "I promise." As summer turned to fall and Julia's belly grew round with their child, Frank found himself more content than he had ever been. This was what he had been searching for during all those years of drifting: a home, a wife, a family on the way. The homestead was thriving under their combined efforts. They had money saved from selling eggs and vegetables in town. Life was good. In November, when Julia's time drew near, Frank took her to Vulture City to stay with Margaret and Sean. He would not risk her giving birth at the isolated homestead. For 3 weeks, he camped on the O'Brien's floor, refusing to leave Julia's side. When her labor finally began, Frank paced outside the bedroom while Margaret and the doctor attended Julia. Every cry from the room made him flinch. He prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life, bargaining with God, promising anything if Julia and the baby would just be all right. After what felt like an eternity but was only a few hours, a baby's cry rang out. Frank's heart stopped. Then Margaret opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Frank, a healthy baby boy, and Julia is fine. She is tired, but she is fine." Frank nearly collapsed with relief. He stumbled into the room where Julia lay, exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. Frank approached slowly, almost afraid this was a dream that would dissolve if he moved too fast. "Come meet your son," Julia said softly. Frank sat beside her and looked down at the red-faced baby in her arms. The child had a tuft of dark hair and tiny perfect fingers that waved in the air. Something cracked open in Frank's chest, a place that had been frozen since the day he buried Mary and their stillborn son. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. Frank thought for a moment. "What about Thomas after your first husband and James for my father?" Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas James Northwood, I love it." Frank kissed his wife gently. "Thank you. For this, for everything. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." They stayed in town for 2 weeks, letting Julia recover and making sure the baby was strong before traveling back to the homestead. The O'Briens were wonderful, treating little Thomas like their own nephew. Margaret proved to be a fountain of knowledge about babies, helping Julia learn to nurse and care for the infant. When they finally returned home, it was to a cabin that Frank had prepared during his trips back and forth. He had built a cradle for the baby, stocked the pantry, and made sure everything was ready for his new family. That first night back, as they lay in bed with baby Thomas sleeping in his cradle beside them, Julia turned to Frank. "Did you ever imagine, when you knocked on my door that night during the storm, that this is where we would end up?" Frank thought about it. "No. I was just trying to survive the night. I had no idea I was about to find everything I had been searching for." "I was so afraid when I opened that door," Julia confessed. "A strange man in the middle of a blizzard. I almost did not let you in." "What made you?" "Something in your eyes. You looked lost and alone, and I knew how that felt," she smiled. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Frank corrected. "The best was agreeing to marry me." "That was rather a good decision, too." They laughed softly, not wanting to wake the baby. Frank pulled Julia close, marveling at how much his life had changed in less than a year. He had gone from a drifting cowboy with no place to call home to a husband and father with everything to live for. The winter that followed was hard, as mountain winters always were, but the cabin was warm and full of love. Frank kept the fire burning and the wood stocked. Julia took care of their son and kept their home. Together they weathered the cold and snow, no longer alone. Thomas proved to be a good baby, healthy and strong. He had Julia's blue eyes and Frank's stubborn chin. Watching Julia with their son, Frank fell in love with her all over again. She was a natural mother, patient and loving, singing the old songs as she rocked Thomas to sleep. One evening in February, exactly a year after the storm that had brought them together, Frank and Julia sat by the fire while Thomas slept. Outside, snow was falling again, but this time it held no threat, only beauty. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked. "Letting a stranger into your home, marrying him so quickly?" Julia looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment, do you?" "No. I was just thinking about how much can change in a year, how one storm, one moment of chance can alter the entire course of a life." "It was not just chance," Julia said softly. "I believe we were meant to find each other, two people who had lost so much, who had almost given up on happiness. We were meant to have a second chance." Frank reached out and took her hand. "I love you, Julia, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I love you too. You saved me, not just from being lonely, but from forgetting how to hope. You saved me too." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn and listening to their son's soft breathing. Outside, the storm that had brought them together raged on in memory only, a reminder of what they had survived and what they had found in the cold. The years that followed were good ones. The homestead prospered under Frank's hard work and Julia's careful management. They added on to the cabin, building 2 more rooms as their family grew. 2 years after Thomas, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Mary Elizabeth, after Frank's first wife and Julia's mother. Then came another son, William, and finally another daughter, Sarah. Frank proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving with his children. He taught them to ride and rope, to tend the animals, to love the land that sustained them. Julia filled their home with warmth and laughter, teaching the children to read and write, to cook and sew, to be kind and honest. The people of Vulture City eventually accepted Frank and Julia fully. Their love story became something of a legend in the area, the widow who took in a stranger during a blizzard and found love again. Other couples looked to them as an example of how happiness could be found even after loss. Margaret and Sean O'Brien remained close friends. Their children grew up together, spending summers at each other's homes, forging bonds that would last a lifetime. The two families celebrated holidays and birthdays together, creating traditions and memories. As the children grew, Frank sometimes told them the story of the storm that brought him and their mother together. The tale never got old, and the children never tired of hearing it. "Tell us again about how you almost froze to death, Papa," young William would beg. "Tell us about how you were afraid to share the bed," Mary Elizabeth would add with a giggle. Frank would laugh and pull Julia close. "It was the best storm of my life," he would say, "because it brought me to your mother." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Julia back to the hotel in Vulture City, where they had spent their wedding night. The children stayed with the O'Briens, and for 2 days, Frank and Julia were just a man and woman in love, not parents with responsibilities. "Do you remember our wedding night?" Frank asked as they lay together in the same room where they had first been husband and wife. "I remember everything," Julia said. "I remember being nervous and excited and so in love with you I could hardly breathe. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. I still think that." Julia traced the lines that time and work had etched into Frank's face. "We have built a good life, haven't we? The best life. You, the children, the homestead, everything I could ever want. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had made it to Vulture City that night? If the storm had not caught you?" Frank considered this. "Sometimes. I would probably have worked a season on some ranch, then moved on to the next place. I would still be drifting, still be alone." He kissed her softly. "That storm was the best thing that ever happened to me. It brought me home." As the years continued to pass, Frank and Julia grew older together, their love deepening with time. They faced hardships, as all families did. A drought one year that nearly killed the crops, a winter when Thomas caught pneumonia and they feared they might lose him, the death of Julia's mother in Pennsylvania that she grieved deeply. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and from the family they had built. The children grew tall and strong, full of life and promise. Thomas showed a talent for working with horses. Mary Elizabeth had her mother's beautiful voice and sang in the church choir. William loved books and learning, already talking about becoming a teacher. Little Sarah, the baby, had her father's adventurous spirit and was always getting into mischief. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Thomas was 21 now, courting a girl from town. Mary Elizabeth was 18 and beautiful, with several young men vying for her attention. William was 16 and already helping to teach at the school in Vulture City. Sarah was 14 and still convinced she would grow up to be a cowboy like her father. Frank looked around the table at his family, at the children he and Julia had raised, and felt profound gratitude. He caught Julia's eye across the table, and she smiled at him, that same warm smile that had first touched his heart 20 years ago. After dinner, when the children were occupied with cleaning up and playing with the O'Brien children who had come for the celebration, Frank took Julia outside to watch the sunset. 20 years, Julia said, leaning against him. "It seems like forever and no time at all." "I would live every day again, exactly the same," Frank said. "Well, maybe except for the drought year," Julia laughed. "And the year William broke his arm falling out of the barn. And the time Mary Elizabeth decided to cut her own hair." They laughed together, remembering all the trials and joys of raising their family. Then Frank grew serious. "Julia, I want you to know something. Every single day for the past 20 years I have thanked God for that storm, for bringing me to your door, for giving me a second chance at love and family. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Julia turned in his arms and kissed him. "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me. I was so lost and alone before you came. You brought light back into my life. You gave me a family, a future, hope. We gave that to each other." They stood together watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, the same mountains that had nearly killed Frank 20 years ago but had instead led him to his destiny. Behind them, in the cabin they had expanded and improved over the years, their children laughed and talked, full of life and possibility. "You think they understand how lucky they are?" Julia asked. "To have a family that loves them, a home that is secure? Maybe not yet. But they will when they are older and have children of their own. Thomas will marry his Sarah soon, I think, and Mary Elizabeth has that young rancher calling on her. They are growing up, Yes, soon they will have homes of their own. It will just be us again. Frank smiled. I am looking forward to that. Just you and me like it was in the beginning. Are you? I thought you loved having the house full of noise and chaos. I do, but I also love you, Julia. Being alone with you is never something to dread. As the sun set and the stars began to appear, Frank and Julia went back inside to their family. But they carried with them the knowledge that whatever the future brought, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything for the past 20 years. The seasons continued their endless cycle. Children grew and married and started families of their own. Thomas married his Sarah and started a ranch near Leadville. Mary Elizabeth married her rancher and moved to a spread south of Vulture City. William became a teacher and married a fellow teacher, settling in town. Sarah, true to her independent nature, trained horses and helped run the homestead with her parents, content to remain unmarried for the time being. Frank and Julia became grandparents, a role they embraced with joy. Their grandchildren spent summers at the homestead, learning the same lessons their parents had learned, hearing the same stories of how their grandparents met. On their 30th anniversary, Frank woke to find Julia already up, standing at the window looking out at the mountains. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how that storm brought you here 30 years ago today," Julia said. "Well, not today exactly, but 30 years ago this winter. The best storm of my life. Mine too." She turned in his arms. "Frank, we have been blessed. Our children are happy and healthy. We have grandchildren who bring us joy. This land has provided for us. We have each other. We have been very blessed. I want you to know, in case I have not said it enough over the years, that you made me believe in love again when I thought that part of my life was over. You gave me more than I ever dreamed I could have." Frank cupped her face in his weathered hands. "And you gave me a home when I was lost. A family when I thought I would die alone. A reason to stop drifting and start living. I love you, Julia. I always will." They kissed, a kiss that held 30 years of love and commitment, of trials weathered and joys shared. When they pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes. 30 more years. Julia asked with a smile. "At least," Frank promised. "They did not get 30 more years. Few people do. But they got 15 more good years together, years filled with love and family and the satisfaction of a life well lived. They saw all their children settled and happy. They welcomed more grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Sarah eventually married a horse trader and built a cabin on the far edge of the homestead property, staying close to her aging parents. She and her husband became the caretakers of the land, ensuring that the homestead Frank and Julia had built together would remain in the family. When Frank was 70 years old, he became ill with a fever that the doctor could not cure. He grew weaker over the course of several weeks, and the family gathered, knowing the end was near, on a cold winter night, with snow falling gently outside just as it had the night he first arrived. Frank lay in the bed he had shared with Julia for 45 years. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her hair white now but her eyes still that same bright blue. "You remember the night we met?" Frank asked, his voice weak. "Every detail," Julia said, fighting tears. "You were half frozen and covered in snow. I was so afraid to let you in. But you did." "Best decision I ever made," Frank smiled. "I love you, Julia. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. I love you too, always." Their children and grandchildren were gathered around, filling the room with love. Frank looked at each of them, his legacy, the family he and Julia had created together. "Take care of your mother," he said to them, "and take care of this land. It has been good to us." "We will, Papa," they promised. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, Frank's breathing grew shallower. Julia held his hand tightly, willing him to stay but knowing she had to let him go. Just before dawn, as the first light touched the mountains, Frank took his last breath. Julia sat beside him for a long time, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. She had lost Thomas 47 years ago and had thought she could not survive such grief again. But she had Frank for all those years in between, 45 years of love and partnership. And she would hold onto those memories for whatever time she had left. The family buried Frank on a hillside overlooking the homestead, under a pine tree he had always loved. The whole community came to the funeral, testifying to the impact Frank had made in his years there. Story after story was told of his kindness, his hard work, his devotion to his family. Julia stood at his grave after everyone else had left, looking out at the mountains where the storm had driven Frank to her door so many years ago. "Thank you," she whispered, "for every moment, for loving me, for giving me a family and a life beyond anything I could have imagined. I will love you always." She lived for 3 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still strong and sharp-minded despite her age. She spent her days telling stories of Frank, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations. She quilted and gardened and enjoyed her great-grandchildren. On a spring morning, when the mountains were green and wildflowers carpeted the meadows, Julia passed away peacefully in her sleep. Sarah found her in the morning, a smile on her face as if she had been dreaming of something pleasant. They buried her next to Frank under the pine tree, and the whole community mourned. But there was also celebration, for Julia had lived a long and good life, full of love and family. Years later, when the homestead had passed to the 3rd generation, when Vulture City had grown and changed, people still told the story of Frank and Julia Northwood. They told of a cowboy caught in a blizzard who knocked on a widow's door seeking shelter and found love instead. They told of how 2 lonely people, each broken by loss, had found healing in each other. They told of the family they built and the love that lasted until the very end. The cabin still stood, expanded and improved over the years, but still fundamentally the same small shelter where 2 people had once shared a bed with a blanket barrier between them. The pine trees Frank had planted around it had grown tall and strong. The land he and Julia had worked together continued to sustain their descendants. And on cold winter nights, when storms came down from the mountains, the family gathered around the fire and told the story again. The story of how what began in cold ended in the warmest love. The story of a blizzard that changed 2 lives forever. The story of Frank and Julia, whose love had built a legacy that would endure for generations. The storms still came every winter, just as they always had. But in the warm cabin, surrounded by family, the cold could never touch the love that had been born in its midst. Frank and Julia's story became a legend, a testament to the power of second chances, of love that heals, of 2 people finding exactly what they needed in the last place they expected. And though they were gone, their love remained, woven into the fabric of the homestead, the family, the land itself. Every grandchild and great-grandchild who grew up hearing the story understood that love was worth the risk, that opening your door to a stranger might just mean opening your heart to your destiny, and that the coldest night could lead to the warmest love. The homestead thrived through the years, through all the changes that came to the west. The railroad arrived, bringing more people and commerce. Towns grew into cities. The wild frontier became more settled and civilized. But through it all, the Northwood homestead remained, a constant in a changing world, built on the foundation of a love that had begun in the midst of a blizzard and had endured through everything that followed. Frank and Julia's story reminded everyone who heard it that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that it was never too late for a second chance, and that sometimes the storms we think will destroy us actually bring us exactly what we need. It was a story of hope and healing, of loneliness transformed into belonging, of two broken people becoming whole together. And so the legend lived on, passed down through generations. A love story born in the Wild West winter of 1878, when a cowboy trapped in a blizzard knocked on a beautiful widow's door and found not just shelter from the storm, but a home, a family, and a love that would last not just a lifetime, but for all the generations that followed. What had begun in the bitter cold had indeed ended in the warmest love, a love that warmed not just two hearts, but all the hearts that came after, forever and always.